Hi everyone. Thanks for joining us for today's Health Action webinar on family separation and its impacts on child and family health. My name is Shadi Hushiar, and I'm the Director of Early Childhood and Child Welfare Initiatives at Families USA. Before we begin, I'd like to introduce my co-presenters for today's webinar. Susan Church is a trial and appellate attorney focusing on immigration law and criminal defense. In 2001, she received the Detention Panel Attorney of the Year Award from the Political Asylum Immigrant Representation Project. Susan advocates for immigrants with criminal convictions facing deportation and immigrants seeking immigration benefits in the U.S. In 2017, she successfully sued President Trump for his anti-immigrant travel and visa processing ban on Muslim immigrants from 7 affected countries, obtaining a temporary restraining order from the Federal District Court. She's been working to help reunite families impacted by the administration's family separation policy and joins us today to share her experiences. Emily Butera serves as Senior Policy Advisor for Migrant Rights and Justice at the Women's Refugee Commission. An expert on the protection of families duly affected by the U.S. immigration and child welfare systems, Emily's work focuses on mitigating the effects of immigration enforcement, detention, and removal on family unity, parental rights, and child well-being. Emily has extensive experience advocating before Congress and executive agencies on a wide range of issues, including immigration detention reform, the protection of unaccompanied and separated children, and gender inclusivity in immigration law. Myra Alvarez is president of the Children's Partnership, a national nonprofit organization working to ensure all children have the resources and the opportunities they need to grow up healthy and lead productive lives. Under her leadership, TCP is building strong community partnerships, conducting forward-looking research, and advancing informed policy that betters the health and well-being of underserved children in California. She combines her decade of experience in healthcare policy and community outreach with her personal conviction that every child and family should have the opportunity and resources to pursue their dreams. Thank you all for joining us, and let's get started. So I wanted to begin by talking a little bit about family separation and the impacts on child health. The research is pretty clear that children's health and well-being are impacted by traumatic family separations. Research on the impact of family separation is backed by additional research on its physiological impacts. This research tells us that children who experience separation, whether through the death of a parent, incarceration, or through a traumatic experience, like the separation of immigrant families at the border, face serious health consequences. We know that separating children from their parents is always devastating, no matter what the circumstances. And family separations at the border have been described as sudden, unexpected, and traumatic. During stressful times, children's well-being and ability to cope is really dependent on the presence of a safe, nurturing caretaker, often their parent. Not only have children been forcibly separated from their parents at the border, but reports from detention facilities are that staff have been told to withhold from physically comforting children, even toddlers, and that siblings have been asked permission had to ask permission to hug one another. Children are scolded for crying. Many children are now experiencing prolonged separations, and the longer the separation, the more traumatic the experience. For those who are reuniting, transition has been difficult. We're now seeing stories of young children crying when they first see their parents again, fearful that their parents will leave them, and reluctant to leave their side, experiencing nightmares and having difficulty regulating their emotions. We know a lot about the harmful effects of parental separation on child well-being from research that's been done in the past with children in Romanian orphanages, children in foster care, and children of incarcerated parents. Recent work has also documented the increased mental health risks that both parents and children are facing when separated in an immigration process. So research tells us that parent-child separation has long-term effects on child well-being even after families are reunited. And among the effects of separation on children and later into adulthood are an increased risk for mental health problems, poor social functioning, and disrupted stress reactivity. So what we're really talking about when we talk about family separation is childhood trauma, which is really just the child's inability to respond to an overwhelming situation, and it has impacts on both their psychological and on their biological processes. And so it's not surprising that the symptoms of childhood trauma are really many of the same ones we've now seen reported for children who are experiencing family separation. I mentioned the physiological impacts of family separation, and this includes toxic stress. So while some types of stress are normative and actually good for development and can have positive effects, severe chronic stress is toxic. So our regulatory system includes our hormonal responses that go up and down to help us really respond to external threats. So you often hear about our flight or fight response. When stresses are chronic, as is the case in toxic stress, this leads to an ongoing activation of the system, meaning that a child is in a constant state of alarm. Parental separation is considered a toxic stressor. It's an experience that engages strong and prolonged activation of a child's stress management system, and this has serious consequences for their long-term well-being. So the physiological and the psychological toll of early stress, toxic stress, this includes stress from separation, changes how the body essentially responds to stress in the long term, disrupting a range of things, including cognitive and affective processes, essentially changing the brain structure and functioning. This not only prevents the body from really expending energy on the other things that children should be doing, like learning and development, but it also causes a strain on other body systems and changes the actual architecture of the brain. And this increases the risk for a host of poor outcomes and leads to things like anxiety, depression, and vulnerability for other health concerns. So these findings that we just discussed are really confirmed by one of the largest studies of its kind called the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. And that helps us to understand the impact of early experiences on a range of social and health outcomes later in life. Specifically, the ACEs study looked at early trauma and found that neurobiological, psychosocial, and health risk effects, as well as links to a number of health conditions, including depression, heart disease, and even cancer. So what the study really confirmed is that early experiences matter. But it's also important to state and to really recognize that risk factors are just that, a risk. They're not predictive factors, which means that they can be changed and that one's trajectory can change even after being exposed to trauma. And what's really important here is the presence of protective factors that can help buffer or mitigate that risk, essentially offering sort of an additional protection against the effects of early stress. So what's the most important protective factor? A primary caretaker or a parent. Children depend on their primary caregivers to successfully help them navigate stressful and traumatic events. Supportive early relationships offer a protection against the effects of stress, and children's physiological responses to stress can be significantly reduced by the access to their primary caretaker. So as you can see, it's really problematic to think about children being separated from their parents because they don't get to have this buffer to help them manage the trauma of separation. They essentially experience a double trauma, the forced separation itself and then the absence of their caregiver to help them cope with the trauma. So I'll wrap up by stating what's really clear here is that family separation is a terrible policy for many reasons, not the least of which is the impact on the health and well-being of children. This administration has to act quickly to reunite children and their parents. And let's be clear that family detention is not an appropriate solution here. We have a responsibility to help these families who have been separated, and families need access to resources and services to help mitigate the physical and psychological impacts of being separated. And the kinds of things that they need include ensuring that families don't suffer re-traumatizing through detention or deportation practices that risk separating families again and causing further harm, helping families access evidence-based practices and treatments to address trauma, and integrating trauma-informed care into multiple systems that interact with immigrant families, and ensuring that the barriers that they face to accessing services and basic safety net programs are removed. So that's my presentation. I'm going to turn it over to Susan.
Thank you so much. So I'm an immigration lawyer, and as a result of my job as an immigration lawyer, I've represented now a couple of families who've had this family separation happen to them at the border. And, you know, at the top of this presentation, if you can turn to the next page, it talks about zero tolerance. Can you switch the slide? it talks in the next slide. It talks about quote-unquote zero tolerance policy, but I think it's really important to understand that the separations happening at the border are not happening as a result of this alleged zero tolerance policy. That is a cover that was provided by the administration to cover their actions. And the reason we know that is a number of reasons. First of all, if you're familiar with the ACLU lawsuit that's pending in San Diego that the judge has been ruling the families must be reunited, the lead plaintiff in that case presented herself lawfully at the border and asked for asylum and was separated from her child and was never charged with illegal entry. My client, Angelica, who's I'm going to talk about later, also was separated from her child at the border but never charged with illegal entry into the United States. In March, long before the administration announced its quote-unquote zero tolerance policy in April, Raices, who is a immigrant advocacy group on the border, had identified over 400 families already who had had their children taken from them upon entrance at the border. The zero tolerance policy was announced in April as the facts became clearer and clearer that this had become a policy of the administration and the outrage started to spread. The second named plaintiff in the ACLU lawsuit that was filed back in February of 2018 also had never been charged with illegal entry. Many of our clients who you see, for example, I worked with a law firm in Boston who recently had a 9-year-old boy reunited with them. Their client was not charged with illegal entry. So it's really not an issue of zero tolerance, and it's, I find that narrative is frustrating to me because it really is a cover that the administration has been using to cover up their policy. So if you're interested in more material on the actual ACLU lawsuit, it is pretty fascinating. There's a bunch, if you're a lawyer especially, but there's a bunch of affidavits contained within the original document that was filed. The website with access to the materials is at the bottom of this screen, and that actually also gives you live updates of the rulings of the judge in the San Diego case. And can we have the next slide, please? So I represented Angelica, who has been profiled now in the Washington Post, and if you saw when she was reunited with her child, we'd been contacted by multiple media outlets, and what we decided to do, because my client is really an advocate for others in this situation, is to give CNN an exclusive, so you may have seen her reunion. It's with a 7-year-old girl who turned 8 in the shelter. She's extremely emotional and crying and asking and begging her daughter to forgive her for having let her be subject to this. It's very powerful video. I'm not even sure if you should watch it because it's emotionally jarring to see. Sometimes when I think about it myself, I cry. But our client came across the border on May 9, 2018, and she was very, very close into the United States when she was caught by Border Patrol with her daughter. At the time that they arrived, her daughter was 7, and she turned 8 in the shelter. She left Guatemala because of an extremely violent ex-husband, who was highly abusive to her, and basically she feared for her life and her daughter's life. The day after her arrival, she was brought into a small room with Customs and Border Patrol officers, and they asked her, they told her that they were taking her daughter and that the daughter was going to a separate place from her. And I think you can all put yourselves in the place of my client and imagine how devastating that felt. At that moment, right after she was told that they were going to take her daughter from her the next day, they asked her if she celebrated Mother's Day in Guatemala, and she said yes. And the Border Patrol officer then said, well, happy Mother's Day. And really it was just the cruelest of all cruel acts by this particular officer, and added immensely to my client's trauma. My client had no idea when she arrived in the United States that this was a policy of the government. She indicated to me that many people would come anyways because their lives are in severe danger, and so are their children's lives. And even if their children have to be taken from them, that their life could be saved by doing so, they would still risk doing that again. And I think that the policy of the administration is really ignorant of how bad things are in the triangle of Central America with gang violence and domestic violence. The next day, after she was told that she was going to have to take her daughter, she was told to wash her child, give her a shower, comb her hair, and put her clothes on. And her clothes that she was forced to put on were these oversized, baggy clothes. All the children lined up in a line, because there was many women who were giving up on their children that morning, and they were lined up reminiscent of, children going onto the trains during the Holocaust, put on buses and sent away. The entire time, my client laughed with her daughter, smiled, hugged her, acted what I consider to be beyond brave. And sorry, I get emotional when I start telling the story again, but she said she watched her child go away on the bus and spent the day crying, and the next day crying. She was then transferred from multiple facilities and had no idea where her daughter was for over 2 weeks. She put in what she describes as countless request slips to get the name and phone number of where her daughter had been sent to. No one would tell her. She was also told by a Customs and Border Patrol officer that she would never see her daughter again. The only way she finally found her daughter was she had made her daughter memorize the phone number for the family in Guatemala. And in memorizing that phone number, the daughter, and we're talking about a 7-year-old girl here, the daughter called the grandmother in Guatemala and told the grandmother, "This is where I am, here's the phone number." And that's how our client finally found her daughter. It wasn't through the jail facility that she was at or any other assistance. It was through her daughter remembering the phone number. So you can imagine how difficult it has been and continues to be for people with very small children who aren't capable of memorizing phone numbers. The daughter turned 8 in the shelter, and by really all luck in the world, our client was actually released from custody on June 19th, which is very rare. You'll see some of these reunions occurred because people were given a hearing before an immigration judge rather than a credible fear asylum interview. And those people have had a lot more success getting their children out than people in custody. All the pleadings and the paperwork for the case, including a really, I think, a very emotional affidavit written by Angelica, is cited at the bottom of this screen, and you can turn the page now. So I'm sure everyone wants to know, how are they doing now? Our client, I think the most emotional point for me in this whole case besides the reunion was the time that our client was at the offices of the Attorney General, and after she got out of custody, she wasn't given her daughter. She was required to submit fingerprints again for her daughter, and I'll go over that later. She was required to jump through hoops, fill out multiple applications for return of her daughter. And while that process was ongoing, she was given only 2 phone calls with her daughter a week, and those phone calls were limited to 10 minutes. And if she missed that phone call, she would only get 10 minutes talking to her daughter a week. Sorry, my phone just rang. She was at the offices of our Attorney General in Massachusetts helping them with the state lawsuit, and it was her time to have her conversation with her daughter. And she got on the phone with her daughter, and she was, Mother of the Year, laughing, joking, telling the daughter she looked so beautiful, telling her she missed her, telling her, "I can't wait to see you again. It's going to be soon. It's going to be soon. I'm fighting for you. I'm here at the offices of the lawyers fighting for you." And when she hung up the phone, she started sobbing hysterically. And that's what she's had to do throughout this process, is remain brave, braver than I am, because I still can't get over it, obviously. So there was an interesting article in the Washington Post about Angelica's case where they talked about what it's like afterwards What I've seen in my representation of them is the daughter's had nightmares, of course. She has bizarre fears where, like a toddler touched her at a school, and in the process of touching her, the little girl just completely freaked out and started screaming. She blames her mother for the separation, which breaks my heart to think of it, because obviously the mother is not at fault here, but that's how children think. She, for a long time, wouldn't even let the mother out of her sight since the reunion, and I think only recently has gotten a little bit braver about that. So if you can go to the next stage. Then there's another article in Washington Post about that. So how did we get this reunification to happen? It was ridiculous. I've never experienced such moral outrage, I think, in my entire legal career. And that's saying a lot because I've been an immigration lawyer since 1998. Parents and mothers and fathers who are released were required by this administration to, quote unquote, sponsor their own children. So even though the government took the child away from the parent, the government refused to return them unless the government decided that the parent was a fit parent. Now, the way it works for any other person in the world, in the country, is you have to have certified claims of abuse or neglect found against you before you lose any custody rights to your child. And so these individuals were given fingerprint appointments at a contractor of the Office of Refugee Resettlement. And so this fingerprint appointment for my client, she was released from custody on June 19th. She filed her application to obtain custody of her own daughter on June 22nd. She was told, before lawyers got involved, that the soonest she could get her fingerprints taken was July 31st. So had lawyers not intervened, she wouldn't even have started the process, in my opinion, until now. And we're not even close to July 31st. We called the shelter, and we actually worked with Southwest Keys, and I have to say the shelter was extremely sympathetic and did anything they could within their power to advance Angelica's case. They changed the fingerprint appointment to July 16th. And we had been told that from that July 16th date, you were still talking another week to 3 weeks before they would process the paperwork. We then contacted multiple congressional people, including Catherine Clark and Joe Kennedy in Massachusetts, who personally called, not had their aides call, but personally called the shelter and the field supervisors and had the fingerprint appointment expedited to July 3rd. So Angelica's is a happy story because there are still parents out there without access to attorneys who are still fighting for reunification. There are still all the people who are detained who are fighting for reunification. Other parents I've worked with, I worked with a case in Boston of a mother represented by Wilmer Hale, and that client had fled an abusive partner in Brazil and came here to avoid the abusive partner. And once she was here, they told her that we can't give you your child back because we have to conduct a home study of the family that you're going to live with because your child's been the victim of abuse by its father in the past, even though the father was who they were fleeing in Brazil. There have been financial requirements for reunification and religious questions. The first question I was asked when I represented Angelica and filled out a form for her was, what's Angelica's religion? DNA test because they've lost the contact information. So there was I don't even know how to explain it, but my understanding is that a huge portion of the records of who was the parent of who was deleted after the people came in. And so only the people who have, up until now, up until a judge ruled last week in Matter of L that this process was obscene, only those people with connections and lawyers and lots of assistance were seeing reunification. And can we go to the next slide? So, what can be done? There's, I know these are the two fundraisers I know of individual people that are given out for individual people. Mine, Angelica is the first client, and then the Wilmer Hale case is the second client listed there. But there's a lot of great organizations on the ground. American Immigration Council is a immigrant advisory group that actually provides legal advice to lawyers, but they set up free legal service for the cases in Chicago of reunification that we helped get. I helped get them lawyers also, so they provided free lawyers in that sense. Aldea People's Justice Center has done great work. Otro Oledo is a group that I know some of the lawyers there, and they actually were involved in the caravan. If you may be aware of people who came in a caravan to the border and applied to come in. And then the Florence Project also has done great work on the border. Raíces has done great work also, but my understanding is they've raised $20 million through Facebook, so I point out these other groups because they're all been working on the border for many years. And people really need lawyers. I'm working with a family right now who the dad is here and the 5-year-old daughter is in New York, and we're trying to get reunification for him. But he told the asylum officer when he was interviewed that he wasn't afraid of returning because somebody told him, somebody meaning CBP, obviously Customs and Border Patrol, that the fastest way to see his daughter again was to give up his asylum claim. So he did. So he needs a lawyer to get down there and reopen his case so he can reunite with his daughter in the United States. And I think that's the end of my presentation. Mental health treatment. So in the medical field, what a lot of our clients undergo is a complete lack of identification documents. There's no ability to get a driver's license in all states in the United States. If they have an asylum claim, they won't be able to obtain work authorization from anywhere from a year to 2 years. Most states, except for the ones listed there, do not even provide health insurance to undocumented children. And only 25 states even provide health care to lawfully residing people. What I think in the medical field should and can be done is a registry of psychiatrists, psychologists, therapists, and social workers who speak Spanish who would be willing to provide free or very low-fee services for these families once they get out. Because not all of them are going to get out, but the ones that are going to get out have undergone significant trauma. And for my client, Angelica, we were not able to find the free service for her because she couldn't drive. She'd had difficulty getting to the place, so it had to be local. Spanish speaking was a challenge, so we ended up finding a paid service that for someone who specialized in trauma. And she's okay because we raised money for her, but I'm sure others are not in the same situation. I also think we have to have a national fund to compensate the victims. And, my little plug, we need to vote in November. So I think that's my last slide. Is that it?
Thanks, Susan. Thank you for that. And thanks for sharing Angelica's story and for just sort of, bringing to light the really problematic vetting process and the barriers and hoops that families have to jump through to be able to be back together where they belong. So if anyone has any questions for Susan now, feel free to go ahead and put them into the chat box. And we'll wait just a moment to see if we have any. And then, we'll continue to take questions, and we'll have an opportunity at the end of the presentations as well for more questions. And I don't see any at this moment, so we can go ahead and move forward. Up next is Emily. If you'd like to go ahead and get started.
Sure. Thanks, Shadi. If you could just advance on to the first slide, that would be great. So let me just build from some of the things that Susan talked about, because I think she's made some points that are particularly relevant for your audience, right, and your interest in this issue, thinking about it through the lens of individuals who are involved in access to healthcare and the healthcare reform. So I do think what Susan said about the tremendous need for not just short-term but long-term medical, mental health, psychosocial supports for these families is going to be critical. And it's going to be a need not only here in the United States for those families who are reunified and are fighting their cases from inside the country, but also regionally for families who have been removed, because we know that at least 400 parents, we think more, have been removed from the country without their children, will be going through a very difficult and traumatic process of trying to reunify with those children. And the needs there will be great. On the language piece, in addition to needing Spanish language speakers, many of the families are indigenous language speakers. So I think that there also needs to be a real effort to identify interpreters who are available to speak some of those languages who probably are not going to be co-located with medical and mental health services but could be brought in telephonically or through other forms of technology. Families are being reunified. The number of reunifications, the pace of reunifications is starting to increase over the last couple of days, and there is an infrastructure that has been put in place to assist families who are reunifying in the U.S. So if you are in the medical or mental health field and feel that you have services or have a volunteer network of services, feel free to reach out to me offside. I don't know if my email address is at the end, but Shadi can certainly connect us, and I can try to point you to the organizations that are involved in that effort. The other thing that I'll just note, because Women's Refugee Commission has spent the better part of the past 2 weeks actually involved in a process to try to track parents who have been separated from their children because the government has not been keeping lists of their own, is I've become very aware of the stress that practitioners, legal service providers, and others who are in the community, often in very remote locations working in detention centers with parents or children, but largely I would say with parents who've gone through this process, who also would benefit from and are calling out for mental health and psychosocial supports of their own. So I think that's another network that we need to think about how we might be able to come together collaboratively to build some supports for. So I'm going to talk a little bit more into the policy weeds to put that framework around the really difficult but really important story that Susan shared of her clients. Try to situate this in a conversation about how we got here, where we are right now, where we expect the policy and the practice will be going. So as Susan noted, family separation is nothing new. We actually started to observe the practice as far back as the summer of 2014 when there was the surge of unaccompanied children and families arriving at the southern border. But the practice of separating families as a method of deterring people from seeking asylum was actually found illegal. It continued, albeit in much smaller numbers, until early May of this year when the Attorney General announced that DOJ was prepared now to take 100% of referrals from Department of Homeland Security of persons who are crossing the border without lawful status. So it gets a little complicated, and I want to try to find the simplest way through the legal technicalities, recognizing that not all of you may be as steeped in the nuances of immigration law as some of us are. But the policy essentially says that 100% of people who have illegally entered or illegally re-entered the United States between ports of entry, so between those places along the border where you would go and apply for permission or provide your passport, 100% of those people would be referred to the Department of Justice for criminal prosecution. The implication of this is family separation. So zero tolerance is a de facto family separation policy, but the policy did not direct Department of Homeland Security to separate families. What it essentially said was because parents are being prosecuted and children cannot be held in secure, i.e. jail-like, facilities that are not licensed for the care of children, those parents and children cannot be together. Therefore, we are going to separate. Now, I think that's a false choice, this choice of family separation or what now has been offered as the alternative, family detention, because we know that there are alternative ways to ensure that people are complying with their immigration case while also being treated much more humanely and having increased ability to meaningfully access our asylum process. And I'll get to there in a moment. To give you a sense of the numbers, the Office of Refugee Resettlement, which is the agency that is responsible for providing care and custody of these children who have been separated from their parents, has acknowledged that 2,654 separated children are in its custody. That includes both the kids they've called tender age kids, kids 4 and under, as well as children between the ages of 5 and 17. That leaves out kids who were separated, came through ORR custody, and were released or were deported. And they've also acknowledged that they've not matched all of the children with parents. they have what they're calling putative parents, so theoretical parental matches for just under 2,500 of the children who are 5 and older. And they have thus far reunited 59 of the children who fall into that tender age category. So we have a long way to go. They've also acknowledged that at least 71 parents who've been separated from their children have not yet been located. The court ordered in the Miss L case that Susan talked about a July 10th deadline for reunification of all of those children 4 and under. The government missed that deadline. And a July 26th deadline for the reunification of children between the ages of 5 and 17. We are likely going to miss that deadline as well, in part because cases have not been identified. The government has done a horrendous job of tracking children and their parents, and there were no systems or procedures put in place at the time this policy was rolled out to figure out how families were going to be put back together again. Next slide, please. In terms of where we're going, we've been starting to talk about it a little bit as building the plane while we're flying it here in the NGO world. And we've been sort of forced into that situation by an administration that did not think through either the humanitarian implications of what they chose to do or the logistical impediments. But I do want to acknowledge that the tremendous amount of public outcry that we saw coming out of the Memorial Day weekend, that period of time where the audio of the young child in a Border Patrol facility who had been separated from her mother was being blasted widely across social media and the news, I think did start to force the government's hand. Unfortunately, it has not forced it enough, and they are twisting the narrative that they are trying to create, I fear, to make the public think that the policy has been brought to an end when in fact it hasn't. So the first implication of public outcry was the June 20th executive order that the president signed purportedly to, quote, maintain family unity. In fact, what the executive order did was reaffirm the zero tolerance or the 100% prosecution policy, continue to allow the separation of families, and also mandate detention of all family units who arrive together in the future. We haven't seen that massive increase in family detention yet because there are not enough family detention beds, but I'm very fearful that that is where we are going. And then, of course, the Miss L case, which Susan did such a wonderful job of explaining. The ACLU has been in and out of court for status hearings about that case pretty much every day last week, and I know that they are back in court today as well, trying to navigate all of the different permutations of family separation that are impeding the family reunification that was ordered by the court. Now, just to kind of clarify the case a little bit, the preliminary injunction that was issued by the judge on June 26th did not require the release of parents and children. It just required the reunification. It established a class of parents, that is, parents whose children were separated from them or could be separated from them by Department of Homeland Security and placed into HHS or DHS custody. It set those timelines that I spoke about a minute or two ago, and also required that parents and children be allowed to speak with each other within 10 days. But obviously, as Susan's case illustrates, that communication has been deeply problematic, and a lot of barriers have been put in place to impede the reunification of children and their parents. We, earlier this week, were quite pleased to see that the court issued a 7-day stay for every family who is reunified. So that 7-day stay kicks off at the moment a family is reunified, and it is intended to allow parents and children some time to readjust the experience of being back together following and in the middle of this trauma, and to talk with attorneys both for the parent and child where attorneys exist to try to figure out what is best for their family, because this experience, in addition to being incredibly cruel, has also been incredibly disempowering. Next slide, please. I think that you know, Shadi and Susan did a really moving job of talking about the lasting damage to child well-being and to the family structures that have been caused by this policy. one of the big things that I do want to highlight is that these children have been rendered unaccompanied by the government. They have been taken away from parents who, as far as we know, are fit and loving parents by DHS, who is an agency that does not have the authority to make determinations about parental fitness, and then they're being made to go through processes that were set out for unaccompanied kids. Those are kids who come to the United States by themselves, not for kids who come with their parents. So it's this effort to undermine child protection standards and sort of a warped interpretation of whether or not a parent is fit. We also know that parents have, in many instances, been pressured to make decisions without full knowledge of their rights, including their right to reunify with their child. And some parents have withdrawn their case because they had been told that they must do so in order to get their child back. Next slide, please. And that brings us to a really quick mention, although I think it deserves more time, really, on the intersection between family separation policy and larger attacks on the asylum system. A significant number of these families are asylum seekers. They have brought their children on what is a very arduous journey in an effort to try to save those children's lives, because conditions in Central America, particularly the Northern Triangle of Central America, are pretty horrific, and particularly as a result of violence against women and violence carried out by criminal entities like the cartels. Separating families in an effort to get them to give up their asylum claim and deter other asylum seekers from coming is just one piece of this, but we're also seeing asylum seeker families being prevented from approaching a port of entry to make an asylum claim. And we have seen in recent weeks rollbacks of long-standing protections for domestic violence victims, as well as children who are fleeing gangs. And so while we're dealing with family reunifications of those who have been separated in the short term, we also know that we have much longer-term challenges ahead of us with the likely increase in family detention that I mentioned, as well as what we know is already happening and expect to happen in the future in greater numbers, which is that children and parents will be turned back to unsafe situations where their lives are at risk. So if you take nothing away from this conversation about asylum other than this, please remember that every individual has the right to seek asylum. Asking for asylum in the United States is not an illegal act, and yet we are treating parents and children who ask for asylum as if they were criminals. Just on the last slide, I want to mention very quickly that there is a better option. There was a family case management program that allowed for families to be in the community receiving wraparound services to help with their compliance with their asylum claims. In the past, it had an over 99% compliance rate. Over 99% showed up for their immigration hearings and check-ins. Unfortunately, the program was terminated in June of last year, but we cannot be caught in believing that family separation and family detention are the only options on the table. There's one more slide. I think that these will be sent around, but it does lay out, in addition to some of the great suggestions that Susan made, some other actions that you can take. And I do just want to echo Susan's request that to the extent individuals want to donate, think about organizations working in your local communities. We can help you find out who those people are. Because the need for resources is great, and we need to make sure that it's dispersed across a very wide range of actors who are coming to respond to this crisis. So thank you. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Emily. So I think we'll hold questions until after Myra's presentation, and then we'll open it up.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Shadi. And hi, everybody. I appreciate the opportunity to join you all today. Next slide, please. So I am Myra Alvarez. I'm president of the Children's Partnership. I am a little bit of a different panelist. I am not as closely ingrained in these issues as my fellow panelists are, and I commend them for the work that they're doing day in and day out to support these children and their parents, and more from a bigger perspective to make sure that what's happening by this administration isn't a reflection of who we are as a people. So thank you for the work that you guys are doing. But my participation on this panel is really to think about how we as health advocates, as child advocates, as folks that may not be on the ground, have a responsibility to engage in this work and support our community partners, our partners working at the national level to push back against the administration and this policy in order to ensure that our collective goals for the health and well-being of our communities are met. Next slide. So really quick, we're the Children's Partnership. We're based in California, and we specifically work on children's health and well-being, focusing on particularly vulnerable populations. And today, that's particularly relevant to the discussion that we're having today, because we think about issues that are impacting children's health within the medical system and as well as outside of the medical system, and really thinking about how our national climate around immigration is impacting the well-being of our children, particularly vulnerable children. Next slide. So today, my goal for my few minutes with you is to think a little bit about our responsibility as advocates for kids, as advocates for health. At our organization, we're first and foremost advocates for children, and we recognize the responsibility we have in the work that my colleagues have discussed today to be allies in this work and really do justice to the collective efforts we engage in to make sure that our communities, our states, our country is the best place for children. So today I really want to talk about how the issue of family separation is relevant to all of us as advocates, whether we're on the front lines or not, how it connects the work to overall impacts of immigration enforcement on the health of children today, and then talk about a bit about what we as advocates can do, really following up on Emily's last slide, to ensure that we're supporting our partners on the front line and recognizing the health impacts that today's climate has on families, including specific activities that we can do as advocates in our communities, as well as in our work with elected officials. Next slide, please. So before I speak to the issue of family separation specifically, I do want to spend a few minutes on context. I think it's particularly relevant because of the demographics of kids in this country today. So in our country, we've seen a rising growth in the number of children in immigrant families. Just in the last 25 years, we've grown to about a quarter of the child population in the country lives in an immigrant family. And if you go to the next slide, and we joke around that in California, Manuel Pastor, a researcher at USC and a leading demographer, he calls California America fast forward because half of our children are part of an immigrant family. And it's particularly relevant to today's discussion because when we think about advocating for health issues, advocating for stronger health policy, for children's well-being, it's really considering the context in which our children are being raised that we need to advocate for the issues that are going to be impacting their health. So next slide. So as health advocates, I think we can all appreciate the role of social determinants of health and really recognizing that there are factors outside of our healthcare system that impact the well-being of children and families, and in particular, the issue of immigration. So we know that there's the critical nature of experiences for children in their first few years of life, but in their developmental stages is particularly relevant to their long-term well-being. Shadi opened up her presentation with the long-term impacts of trauma, the short-term impacts as well, and really considering what our responsibility as health advocates is to promote the best possible environment for children, whether they're children coming to the border or children being raised in this environment. How can we work to better understand how the changing immigration policy context is affecting our nation's children's well-being? Next slide. So really briefly, prior to the administration's policy, there's been a number of actions that were taken that negatively impacted children's well-being. We commissioned a survey with our health center partners here in California, the California Primary Care Association, to better understand what families were experiencing through the perspective of health providers. And what we learned was really concerning and very much consistent with the findings that Shadi shared earlier. One of the most consistent things we heard from providers is that children and families are afraid. And this is before the press attention around family separation. But we heard that children were showing increases in depressive symptoms like sleeplessness or losing their appetite, and that the fear is really keeping families isolated in their homes and out of their communities, obviously disrupting daily routines of children and having long-term impacts on the type of engagement that they partake in that is critical to their healthy development. All of this, we know that there's high levels of anxiety and stress that are impacting the healthy development of children. And we also frequently heard that families were wanting to withdraw from WIC or from SNAP or from Medicaid, and also heard that they were not wanting to do these everyday activities. So really thinking about that context, the multiple attacks on children from this administration before the family separation received the press attention that it received. And that is important to point out because it's these daily microaggressions of stress and trauma that are impacting children's well-being, whether it's they're at the border themselves or they're part of this larger immigrant community that is under attack in multiple directions. Next slide. So further, we did conduct some direct research in our partnership with the California Immigrant Policy Center, the state's leading immigrant rights organization, to learn from families directly. We're going to host a national webinar on August 7th to talk about the findings, but similarly to what we heard from providers, it is that fear and that stress that's alive and well in our community, and that is deepened as a result of what's happening with the family separation issue at the border. And it's within this space that we are operating as health advocates, that we're operating as child advocates, and that we know it's deepening the trauma experienced by kids, again, directly or indirectly. Next slide, please. So in transitioning to the issue of family separation, I think first and foremost, as advocates, we do have to stay informed with the right information from trusted sources, like the organizations on the webinar today. And with that, I think also step outside of our comfort zones and establish working partnerships to identify how best to advance this cause. You know, digital media is a powerful tool that we have at our disposal to frame issues from our vantage point. We've seen this by leading organizations like the American Academy of Pediatrics or others that are outside of the traditional space of immigrant rights, either legal activity or otherwise, really speaking to how these issues impact our everyday activity. Recently, we posted a blog on the National Immigration Law Center's website on family separation, really linking that policy to the other attacks on children that the Trump administration has imposed, really elevating the issue so that maybe folks that don't necessarily consider themselves informed about immigration policy can seek this information from other areas, whether it's a kids organization or a health organization, in order to stay informed and give this issue the attention that it deserves so others can become outraged and participate in our democracy to push back against these policies. I will say that in California, we have celebrated multiple accomplishments towards creating this more inclusive community, like, for example, giving all kids coverage regardless of documentation status that Susan mentioned earlier. And it's those examples of policy victories that are only possible because of a strong and diverse coalition that unites a number of different issues and experiences. And it's this environment, this current political environment, that behooves us to really consider the impact of policy on their health and development. Next slide. So I think part of that is simply showing up and really looking at how, as advocates, we can partner with organizations on the ground to push back. And there are a number of demonstrations. Emily listed off a couple of websites that are showing different opportunities to engage on the ground. We do the same on our website as well as on our social media accounts, but showing up and making sure that there are a number of different voices sharing the concerns and lifting up the concerns that our partners on the ground are. Next slide, please. Similarly, we're doing the same thing with community-level conversations. We've got a series of Let's Talk conversations with schools where we answer questions. It started out to answer questions about repeal of the Affordable Care Act. It has now morphed into answering questions about immigration policy, what's happening and how does it impact families at the state and local level. Again, trying to ensure that right information is distributed to families from trusted sources. Next slide, please. Similarly, with schools, we distribute information related to immigration as trauma in order to ensure that schools are providing safe environments for children, so that what children are watching on television, what their parents are discussing because of a newspaper article that they read, that it's able to be understood in a way that allows them to still learn and thrive in their educational environments. So we've got a number of different resources that help schools create those welcoming environments. Next slide, please. And then finally, again, as Emily alluded to, our responsibility as health advocates, as child advocates, to encourage our policymakers to hold the Trump administration accountable, whether that's in statements that we send or letters or social media, We recently joined, we filed a declaration in support of the Attorney General's lawsuit against the Trump administration, and continue to push our policymakers to a higher standard that prioritizes the well-being of children. Next slide. So finally, this is just a quick snapshot of volunteering and donating and staying loud, and again, referencing the organizations that are on the ground working on this issue. But the Stay Loud is particularly relevant to all of us. We all have a responsibility to support these families and elevate this issue and ensure that it gets the attention that it needs, whether that is calls to Congress or marches and demonstrations, but really looking at our collective power as an advocacy community to push forward a more progressive agenda that supports the health and well-being of children and families. I think we all can take part in that and see that we have a role to play. And next slide is it, and I will turn it back over to Shadi.
Thank you, Myra, and thank you for offering some very specific ways that we can engage and elevate on this issue, and really appreciated that. So we're almost at the hour. I wanted to open it up to see if anyone has any questions. Feel free to enter them into the text box. We'll also be, we'll make available these slides. We'll also make available contact information for our speakers. So if we don't have any immediate questions, we'll go ahead and circulate that information. We'll wait just a moment. So we have a question about the vetting process for determining the parent's fitness and the regulations that were used to make those decisions. And I think it's specifically around the document that DHS released that gave some details around children under 5 having been reunited with their parents and some information as to why some of those parents were deemed ineligible, and asking if anyone can speak more specifically as to how that is decided. I wonder if, Emily, you have any thoughts on that? I know we talked a little bit with Susan. If you're, yeah.
Sure, I can jump in. So where some of the confusion comes from is that there are very specific, well, I shouldn't say specific. There are policies and procedures that are statutory for a class of children called unaccompanied kids, kids who come to the U.S. without a parent or legal guardian. It intends to ensure that those children can be safely released to ideally a parent or another sponsor, but the statutory requirements are actually very vague, leaves OR with latitude to decide how to make that suitability assessment, but doesn't require things like DNA analysis or fingerprinting. Because kids have been rendered unaccompanied when they were separated from their parents, the government has sort of been attempting to subject those kids to the same reunification processes as an unaccompanied child, which we think is inappropriate. So that's sort of prong one of the issue. Prong two is obviously the question about which parents are considered class members under the Miss L order. And we think that the order is written very, very broadly, but the government has taken quite narrow interpretations. In some instances, arguing that if a child was reunified with a sponsor, not the parent, that essentially takes the parent out of class membership. There's been lots of other games that have been played as well, but the long story short is that we think that the government is acting far beyond both what is appropriate and, in the case of DHS, making the decision to separate in the first place, far beyond what their jurisdiction is to determine whether a parent is fit or not, unless there's some clear evidence in front of them that the child is at imminent risk.
And Emily, just to follow on that, I believe the judge in the ACLU website has, lawsuit has said just that the parents of children who have been forcibly separated really should not be subjected to the full extent of the vetting process that those sponsors of unaccompanied children are, and that they should be moving more quickly to reunite children and family and their parents.
So
exactly.
This is Susan. I'm on the call, and they, from what I'm hearing, they are moving more quickly, but in some ways too quickly, because they, we had, I worked with another lawyer whose client was dropped off at a bus stop at midnight, and because she was released, and then the client was child was handed to her, and they ended up, it's kind of chaotic in the sense that now they're expediting them, but without any real assurances of safe transportation or scheduling or anything that's protective of the family.
So I think we have another question around advocacy efforts that you all might be engaged on around reunification that allow families to stay in the U.S.
So one thing that, this is Emily, that I wanted to mention but forgot too, is that there's a national campaign that's come together to end family separation and end family detention called the Families Belong Together campaign. And I know that they will be doing a national update call tonight at 8:30 Eastern, in part to discuss increasing actions around the country as we approach the July 26th deadline for reunification of the older children. So Shadi, I can make sure you have that information. If there are folks who would like to engage in the grassroots advocacy, that might be a good way to begin to do so.
Okay, that would be great. Thank you. Any other questions? Feel free to go ahead and include them in the chat box. Okay, and since we're past the hour, I want to just thank all of our speakers for joining us for this really important conversation. I think we're going to continue to follow this issue closely. Clearly, there are connections to children's health and families' health and just broader implications for the well-being of immigrant families. And so we hope you stay connected with us and with our speakers. And thank you all again for joining us for this conversation.